at the end of the day, uncertainty is uncertainty. And I do think it is the hardest thing in life, at least one of them, to deal with. And to your point, I think like peace and stillness and happiness, I think comes from embracing that uncertainty. And it requires a deep level of trust and certainty that like if we could let go of that need to control and that need to know what the outcome is going to be and when we're going to get that outcome, it requires a leap of faith to trust that like everything will work out. And that's been a big part of my journey.
Well, I'm so excited to welcome our next guest to Quiet Clock Podcast, Jake Kent, the co-founder of Dandi. And we just had Layla's episode drop yesterday. It was lovely to have her too. And you and I were corresponding over emails because I'm so excited about what you're doing and I want to be a part of it in any way and promoting it here. And as we're emailing, I was asking if you had guest suggestions and you said, well, what about having me on? I was like, oh my God, amazing. Because we're always looking for a male perspective. You have a very unique story coming into the fertility space as a man. So we're definitely want to ask and learn about that. So it just made perfect sense as we were emailing to have you here. So welcome.
Thank you.
So excited to have you. And we were talking off camera that before we dive into all things Dandi, I do want to bring up something we came across while preparing for today and having you here is that you used to have your own podcast called Search for More.
Yeah, Searching for More.
Still
live.
Is it still live?
Okay. Well, not as much progress as yours, but yeah.
Well, my gosh, you've been busy the last few years. I wanted to read something that we found that was from there that I think really resonates with a lot of the topics that we talk about on here, because we don't just talk about fertility. We talk about, bringing down societal timelines and expectations and pressure and sort of finding authentic self. And so when we came across your podcast, I listened to a couple episodes, it really resonated. So I wanted to read this and then have you speak to it a little bit, because I think it's really, really powerful and really important. So it says, most of us are living lives that are pretty disconnected from the truth of who we really are. We exist as versions of ourselves we believe will satisfy the world around us, often at the expense of our own happiness. We unknowingly show up as who we think we're supposed to be rather than who we are. Good news, the path to a happier and more vibrant life starts with one simple question. Who were you before the world told you who you were supposed to be?
That's the $1 million question. I think that a lot of us probably are not asking ourselves and should be. Yeah, I mean, that the podcast, that question, some of the themes we explore in that podcast were I think very much built from life experiences that I've had. Mm-hmm. And, like many people, I found myself at a certain point in my life, whether it's family, career, just kind of feeling like I wasn't living the most authentic version of myself. And like there was more to myself to explore. And I think particularly in the world we live in today, right, where it's full of distractions, social media, phones, TV, we're living faster lives than ever before. I think a lot of people don't slow down to realize that, hey, the version of you that is showing up each day in your family, in your relationship, in your friends, in your work, maybe that's not the truth of who you really were when you came into this world.
It's amazing for you to say that, because it resonates so much personally, because I've been trying to slow down and I do a lot. I'm very busy. I have a toddler and it's fast paced, so much distraction. And in the last month, I've been more intentional about slowing down, and I'm just more in tune. Like things are coming to me, thoughts are coming to me that I feel so much more aligned with. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think it is simply the practice sometimes of slowing down.
Yep. Slowing down, disconnecting, and becoming present, right? Again, we're so conditioned to be so focused on the external world. And that's what a lot of this podcast, the premise starts, is like, we've been conditioned from literally the time we're born to focus externally, right, on all the things happening around us. And we become unknowingly conditioned to seek validation from people around us, from circumstances, bosses, friends. And, the byproduct of that is I think we were never really taught the value of going within and becoming more connected to the truth of what's happening inside of us. To your point about slowing down, I mean, it's really the only way to do it. And I think in doing so, you might start to find, that there's a lot of things happening inside of you that, maybe you weren't aware of. And, what I started to find is that the path to fulfillment and satisfaction really started by coming more in touch with some of the things happening within you. And what you start to realize is a lot of the things you thought were really important happening around you, they're not necessarily the things that at the end of the day are going to bring you the true fulfillment.
Yeah, it's amazing because a lot of things that we do talk about here is these like societal milestones of partnership and parenthood. And we've had so many people on here be like, I get those things and I'm still feeling this lack, or I'm still feeling unfulfilled. So I think we have been sold this really harmful narrative that these things will make us happy, these things will make us successful, and it creates so much anxiety and angst around like the timelines. One of the episodes that I listened to, I love how you say, we come into this world with a certain presence, being energy, and then just naturally these societal constructs start to mold us and to form us and put us into these boxes. And I think that rings so true because there's these boxes that we think we have to check. There's these ways we have to be. And I'm sure you relate to this too. As a parent of a toddler, I watch his curiosity. I watch his excitement. I watch his lack of censorship for his emotions. And I'm like, I don't ever want you to lose that. And I'm like, I know this world is going to take all of those things and dull them down.
Yeah. It's emotional just hearing you speak about that. Because first of all, I have the same experience with my daughter. She's 3 years old, incredibly curious, exploratory, right? There's really no sense of self yet, right?
Yeah.
There's just kind of this natural energy of, what you come into the world with and, amplifying that energy out into the world. You're not yet thinking about validation from others. I mean, you're starting to develop some of it, but you're not consciously thinking of it. And I think that, that organic, innate sense of who you come into the world as stays with us, right? But it's the part of us that I think learns to get buried. It's the part that society doesn't really value. And, a big part of this podcast and a big part of a lot of the, work that I've done in my personal life called spiritual discovery, self-exploration, whatever you want to call it, it stems back from that theme. Like I came into this world as a really curious, energetic child. I didn't necessarily fit into some of the societal
and you
constructs.
talk about that in your episode, like what it was like for you to be in school where there's like a lot of structure and rules and
I didn't necessarily fit into it, right? Yeah. And, we could have a whole conversation around where did those societal constructs come from? Like, are they actually serving us or are they just forms of control and structure? And, they do a lot of damage, right? Unknowingly. And, we could talk about this for a while, but we talk about trauma with a big T, right? And some of these really traumatic events, but there's a lot of smaller events that over time can lead to traumatic experiences. And for me, a lot of the school system early on, was challenging for me. So you speak about that natural kind of unvarnished energy that you come into this world with, and I now have the opportunity to look at my 3-year-old, and I've taken some of my experiences. And frankly, the way that some of my, the natural sense of who I wasn't necessarily always met by the world with love and compassion.
Yeah.
And that could start to shape, the defense mechanisms we develop and the sense of false identity of who we need to show up as to protect ourselves.
To be accepted and loved, yes.
To be accepted, right? But what happens when you have that moment where you say, that's not really the truth of who I am, right? And I think a lot of us are struggling with that sometimes unconsciously, right? It's people, there's so many people walking around with anxiety and depression and lack of fulfillment. And we have all these diagnoses, and I'm not taking anything away from medical diagnoses, but, at a certain point, I mean, we have to ask ourselves, who are we showing up as, and what is the disconnect that might exist between the truth of who we really are at our core? So I think, some of those experiences, I think it's a beautiful opportunity to look now back, being the parent and having a child. And to your point, I parent her, and I really try and give her as much freedom, to be herself for as long as we can.
Yeah. One of the questions I ask my clients a lot, which is a simple question, but very complex question, which I think gets muddled by a lot of things that you're saying, is I'll ask them what do you want? And they don't know. They don't know. They don't have a true, authentic, and that's a lot of the work we do is finding that true, authentic answer. And I think that's a big one is not only who do you want to be, but what do you actually want? And we've had so many women on here too, when we're talking about fertility and egg freezing, say, I don't even know if I really want to be a mother.
Right.
And beautiful, but that's also sometimes not met with love, compassion, and acceptance. It's and internally they internalize something is wrong with me because I don't want that.
Yeah. it's a really hard question to, it's like, it should be the simplest question, but it's such a hard, question to answer, because thinking about what you really want, again, implies, first of all, you have a sense of like, what is this truth of self that exists? But it also kind of requires you sometimes to detach from a lot of these societal standards, right? That are like so heavily imprinted upon us from a really young age. And, we kind of get put on this path really early, right? It's like, go to school, get good grades, get good grades to get into a good college, get good college, so you could, get a job and make money and have the family. And it's like this blueprint that we're kind of,
that's laid out for us.
It's laid out for us. And again, it's like, who's to say that is quote unquote the right blueprint? I mean, that might be the blueprint that leads you to kind of this templatized version of what life is supposed to look like.
Oh, I love that, templatized. Yeah.
But if that was such a great template for what life, I don't, better than me what the statistics are in anxiety, depression, suicide, divorce, step back and look at what's going on.
Rising.
There's something off here. And now, what freaks me out, especially as I think about my daughter, it's like we're living in the world of social media.
Oh, I know.
Media in general. And it is just such a heavy and frequent bombardment of reinforcement of this idea of what it's all supposed to look like. And by the way, starting this podcast, the last thing I'll say, starting this podcast, it was scary and very vulnerable for me because, you look around social media and you basically see all the good, right? This is what all the great moments, vacations, dinners, friends. And it's like, there's so few people that are actually talking about the tough moments, right? And we're all having them behind closed doors. Vulnerability is not something society has valued. I personally think vulnerability is one of the most amazing things that there is.
I couldn't, as a therapist, I could not agree more.
And it's interesting. There's been research done. And when I was, in previous careers and jobs managing teams, I tried to lead with a lot of vulnerability because there's a lot of research that's been done that's shown, as a leader, if you can lead with vulnerability, it's actually the quickest way to build trust and connection with others.
Yeah, 1,000,000%.
Because it signals to other people it's okay for you to let your guard
modeling
down.
And you're setting the expectation. You're inviting someone to meet you in that space and saying that it's okay. I'm curious because we have so many women on here. Obviously, we've had the pleasure of having a handful of men. But, what we talk about is women feeling these pressures, the societal expectations to partner up at a certain time, get married at a certain time. And I'm curious, and I'm sure our audience is curious, do men feel, or are men susceptible to the same sort of pressures or timelines, or in a different way? And what does that look like?
I think men are. And I think, not to take anything away from the pressures women feel, and they're probably a different set of pressures, but I think most men probably aren't even aware that they're feeling these pressures, because whereas in certain, and I don't want to speak in broad generalities, but in certain ways, I don't think men have been given permission to, back to your point, create that space and that safety of even saying, let me check in with myself, it's not a manly thing, right? Now I'm cut from a different cloth, and I try and get in touch with my feelings. And I try and lead with and be vulnerable, but I don't think a lot of men have been given permission to do so. And I think that there are a lot of men that feel that pressure. I think a lot of men are following timelines that are perhaps set by, the woman in the relationship. I can tell you from firsthand experience, at the risk of my wife divorcing me here, but I know she's felt pressure at times to achieve certain milestones, let's just call it in our own relationship, whether it's marriage, kids, based on timelines that she's seeing out in the world around her, her friends, so I think a lot of the timelines often get set by the women. And I think a lot of males, I know I myself at times feel maybe a pressure to follow those timelines. And, again, I think probably a lot of men are feeling that pressure, but not necessarily giving them space to step back and say, what does this feel like? And how do I tackle some of the things that I might be feeling.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that. And it's making me think of, we had filmed, this might be back in December, we had filmed a series of episodes. And then I always do a team outing around the holidays with my team. And we were out that night and we met a group of guys and we're telling them about the podcast. And one of the episodes was all the women do the work, all the women do the self-work, men are doing nothing.
Right.
And so we're having this conversation. He's like, we want to. We don't know where to go. And so I think it really speaks to that idea of that permission, that it's okay for men to seek the resources, to seek the help.
Yeah.
Because he was really adamant. He's like, no, we want to self-reflect and build self-awareness and do the things. But so I think there's this misunderstanding. So I'm glad you're here to help, shed some light on this, because I think there's some misunderstanding among women, especially women frustrated in dating, that they're doing all the responsibilities on them to do all the self-help and understand their attachment style and boundaries. And they're thinking men are out there doing nothing to help themselves.
Yeah. And look, again, a lot of it goes back to societal constructs and what is being a man supposed to look like? What is being a woman supposed to look like? And women are supposed to be more in touch with their feelings. Now, these are concepts I don't agree with, but a lot of it goes back to kind of the safety or permission that society has given us. And even becoming a parent, like I said, my daughter's 3 years old, but I didn't feel prepared. I knew I was going to be a great dad because I knew I was filled with love and compassion. But stepping into that world of becoming a dad, late stages of pregnancy, going to the hospital the first time, my wife gave birth during COVID and the nursing team was short staffed, and I was right in the thick of her labor process. And that was a beautiful experience, but a pretty traumatic experience. Not traumatic necessarily in a bad way, but it's a very intense experience watching a human come into this world. And we talk so much about the woman's point of view and postpartum, and I don't take anything away from that. It's 100% valid. But I very infrequently have heard anybody talk about how does that impact the new dad, and what is leaving the hospital for the first time with this little and there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in it. And I just can't help but think how many men, I mean, people in general, but men are going home just bottling all that emotion up.
Oh, totally.
And it's, look, I think men, women, we all need it. But yeah, I think there's a healthy amount of pressure on men. And, I think, creating some safety and some space to connect with that a little bit more would benefit a lot of dads and relationships and parenthood, at large, I think.
Yeah. And I love, as a therapist, I love the word safety and permission. I think that's so great. I think we all need it. I think even, the women that come on here, it is a permission to just move away from this, for everyone, men and women, to move away from the societal constructs if they don't align with who you really are. Was there a moment for you, particularly along your journey in life, where you were like, okay, this is not it? Was there a pivotal moment that you're like, let me start doing some of the work. Let me start going inward.
Honestly, it wasn't. It was more this kind of nagging voice that throughout my life, honestly, from even a young age was present. Right. And I, we could go deep into the spiritual side, but I firmly believe we come into this world with a soul. I don't necessarily think it's a new soul. And I think there's a lot of things that are kind of, etched into who we come into this world as. For me, there was always this sense, and that's kind of where the title for the podcast, Searching for More, came from. There was always this sense of searching for more. This sense that there was more out there for me, that I wasn't necessarily living the most authentic version of myself. So it wasn't a singular acute moment. I think it was more this sense that there was more. And I think at times it's very easy again to kind of, deflect and suppress that voice. And I think for me personally, I won't speak for others, that's where that was always my greatest source of anxiety. And I think we misguidingly sometimes attribute the anxiety to well, my boss said this, or this happened at work, or I'm having this issue in my relationship. I think so much of the time, the anxiety and the stress in life, it's not the external things. I think it's, again, those things that are coming from within that are trying to surface, but we don't necessarily give them the space to surface. So for me, that was a big one. I think, post-college years are when it really started to grow louder and louder and become harder to ignore.
Yeah, I think for me too, post-college, you're kind of at the end of the blueprint. And then it's well, what now? Or you were saying earlier, this is the blueprint. I remember graduating college and I did to move to Europe for a year first. And then when I came back, I started working in finance because, you should work in finance. And I remember walking around the office, these cubicles, and it was bland and it was gray. And I was just this is what I was supposed to do. Yeah. And that for me too was kind of this moment of and maybe it is the end of the blueprint where it's now there's no other step. We're told, I guess marriage and family or whatever, but it's really now the space where you get to think about, what do I actually want to do?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the same question, because you made the pivot, right? And amazing. And now you're doing this podcast and you're, I think, giving others permission to do the same, right? Which I think, modeling in that way is incredibly important. Was there a pivotal moment for you where, you said, this is it, I've got to make a change?
I have to say, I love when guests ask me questions because I love it, because
you made the change. So
I love that, though. I appreciate that. I think one of the pivotal moments was that post-college job where I would walk around that office and I would see it was just, there was no life to it. It was very structured. And I think there was always something inside of me that knew that I didn't kind of conform to those things. I kind of always like to do things a little bit differently. Right. I didn't know what it was going to be. And one of the biggest things for me was having optionality and choice in my life. So the idea of having only 10 vacation days was like, okay, I only get 10 days to choose what I want to do. So that sparked the journey of finding what it was. I didn't know what it was going to be. And I just kept trying. So I have like 3 different masters. I went back to school. I went to school for PR and corporate communications. And I'm like, this isn't it. And I just kept going until something really clicked inside of me. And what that was sitting in my first grad school class for mental health counseling. And that was it. And I kind of just have always, lived by trying and doing and sort of staying aligned with what is me. And so that's been many different path changes. That's been being in school, that's been bartending, that's been coaching, that's been working in an outpatient clinic, to starting my own practice. So I'm someone that can't sit still, or I don't conform well to the structure of things. So I would say that post-college job sparked something in me. That's but it amazing. Was I say all the steps to say it wasn't overnight. Right. There's a lot of work that still went into, me being able to sit here today.
That's amazing. I think that the idea that you tried not just like one pivot, but you tried multiple things. I mean, I think that's another amazing message, because I think in my own life, and I look out at the world, I think like, even the idea, right? You think back to college, it's like pick a focus, right? Pick a degree, like pick what you want your emphasis to be. Besides the fact it's like ludicrous to tell a 17, 18-year-old to like figure out essentially like what you want to focus like yourself, your career on at an age where you're so young. And by the way, there's such a little resource and support to help you make like a thoughtful decision around that. But so many people, I think, find that like that's the path. I probably 80% of the people I know, at least my close friends, like they're doing exactly what they chose, like in that. And not all of them are happy doing it. So like, good for you, by the way. It takes a lot of courage to try new things.
Yeah, I'm always encouraging people to kind of move through that fear and take that leap, because it is so rewarding. And I do remember that post-college job, when I started to take that leap, I had all of my friends around me in finance, and they were not supportive. But I knew the support was coming from more of a place of projection. Like they didn't have sort of the courage to take that risk. And I think a lot of them are still in those jobs and not totally fulfilled and happy. Well, you've also made a lot of pivots. You were sharing with me off camera kind of your career journey, which leads us to our next most amazing topic, is your latest pivot with Dandi. And I'm so excited to hear more about that. I'm so excited about what you guys are doing. And as I said earlier, we had Layla on. You guys are filling an incredibly big gap that is so needed for women. But tell us how you got into the fertility world and what that journey was like for you. Yeah. It's been for you. It's still for you.
Still for me. Yeah. Live and breathe it. And certainly not something I would have ever told you like my career was going to be.
But isn't that like a beautiful thing, right? Like these kind of, if you let life kind of unfold, you're going to find yourselves in like situations you never even imagined.
100%. Right. And it goes back to creating that space. Like if all the slots in your life are full, there's no space for anything to come in. And so, I think some of it's about creating space for the universe to bring like things your way. But I mean, my kind of foray into the fertility space was through like a very peculiar time where I was living with a family member during COVID who was kind of going through the height of her fertility struggles and had lost a lot of time at the wrong clinics with the wrong doctors.
Oh my gosh.
She didn't have, good information that was medically credible and personalized. I'm sure, Layla spoke to you about a lot of that. And was just kind of embarking upon getting up to IVF injections. And I probably represented, I don't know, the 98, 99% of the population that like knows nothing about what fertility struggles actually entail despite the fact like 1 out of every 5 people globally are impacted by, infertility and struggle to conceive naturally. It's a huge problem, right? I would venture to say it has to be one of the biggest global problems that's getting like least attention. And I kind of got this behind the scenes look at what these struggles actually look like mentally, physically, emotionally. And I was blown away, right? I was blown away at what the experience looked like. I was blown away at how life altering it was. And I was blown away by the lack of support, right? I mean, it's the year 2024. There's companies and brands that exist for everything and anything under the sun. And this was like, an experience where, people that are going through it have more at stake than arguably any other experience they're ever going to go through.
It is, I think, as someone who's going through it, it is the most important, hardest, most challenging, vulnerable, intimate. Like it's just, it is a tremendous experience to have to be navigating.
Yeah. And with such little support. So the whole thing just kind of didn't make sense. To me, that there were so many people impacted, the depth of the problem was so deep, and yet there was so little experience. So, we started to get curious and look at the market a little bit more. And, certainly women's health at large has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of investment, a lot of innovation over the last decade. And what we started to see was that like the areas that a lot of this investment and innovation was going to were like these different pockets of women's health. So there was a lot that had gone into like menstruation and menopause, at-home testing, sexual health and wellness. But when we looked at this pocket of like fertility, right, like women and couples and people that are trying to conceive, there was no consumer brand that existed. There was really no support system to help them through it. And
it's so wild to think about. I know that to be true, but it's just, even to hear you say it's 2024, it's so wild to think about.
It didn't make sense, right? And there's clinics, obviously, right? So you have about 450 clinics across the country. Their mandate is to get you pregnant, right? They are medical and clinical in nature. Unfortunately, there's a lot of dollars that are starting to control the way that these clinics are run. There's a lot of private equity that's come into the space. So a lot of the clinics have consolidated. They're focused on operational efficiencies. And unfortunately, while they're doing their job, which is let's try and get as many people pregnant as quickly as possible, they're not built to provide like the personalized care that you as a human need through this experience. And they're not supposed to be, by the way. Like, a lot of the clinics that we've spoken to are eyes wide open. They're like, that's not our job. That's not what we're built for.
That's so interesting. Like, I'm so curious, all that you have learned being, getting Dandi off the ground that is not communicated, I think, to women. And that's, I think, would be extremely helpful if it was. And we've talked a lot on here about what can be done. We're going to have 2 doctors on tomorrow. So I'm so excited. We're going to ask
Fertility
lots of questions.
Doctors? Yeah. Amazing.
But yeah, why isn't more being done to manage the expectation? Because I think if you would say to somebody, and maybe I'll just speak personally, if someone had said to me, here is the experience, you're not going to really hear much from me after this point, the doctor, you're going to hear from the nurses. Like, I think that would have helped a lot. But so many women don't get that expectation managed, and they want someone to hold their hand through it. And then they go through the experience and they feel like they're on a conveyor belt.
Yeah. It's a sad reality. I think there's probably a few reasons. I think the proportions of like clinical staff to patients is just way out of whack, right? Like we were talking about hospitality before. So like I cut my teeth in the world of hospitality and customer experience, and how many people you need to look after a single, customer, a diner in your restaurant. And I've kind of carried that ethos throughout my whole career of, how you build experience, how you curate experience, how you can move a person, a human, a customer, a patient through, building or improving upon an experience. I don't think that's the DNA that like exists on the clinical side of, this kind of issue that we're talking about today. So I think the reality is you have a lot of clinicians that are well-intentioned that come from, medical points of view, and they're just not, their DNA is not to think about experience. Now, what's interesting is you've started to have some brands like, Kind Body, even like Spring Fertility. I mean, there's companies that are starting to pop up in this space that I think are more focused on how do we take the clinical side of this and fuse it with better look, better feel, better design, new tools to improve the experience. But I think at the end of the day, the big issue is it's just like, it's a whole other lift, like really helping someone through the depths of this experience, the emotional support, the mental support. the physical support of getting through, IVF injections and all the things that come along with it. Making sure someone's available the time patients actually need that support is another.
Yeah, because it could be 9:00 at night when you're trying to do a shot and something goes wrong.
And when we've seen that firsthand, and I mean, a big part of, what Layla probably talked to you about is we built this virtual care platform that, and it was hard to build because we really wanted to emphasize, to your point, like, how do we build it in a way that our nurses are available at the on-demand hours that clinics are not? And it's not the easiest thing to find nurses that, want to work at 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night across all the different time zones. And it took us about 2 years to build that.
Yeah.
But now we're really excited that we're starting to see patients reaching out to us like, hey, I'm starting my injections tonight. I need a nurse in an hour. They didn't know this morning or yesterday maybe that they were even starting their injections. Right. Or if they did, they didn't know that they were going to need support. And all of a sudden they find themselves in that very stressful, again, to go back to the word sometimes traumatic moment. In the old way, it was like, I'm going to Google stuff. I'm going to watch old YouTube videos. It's not personalized. It's not medically credible. And there's got to be a higher standard of care. Yeah. So, we're really excited to have, built some solutions that are starting to show up for patients in the moments when they really need it. And we're seeing real impact in the lives of women that need it in these moments.
Again, what you're doing is amazing. What has it been like for you as a man to navigate the fertility space? And not only a man, but you and your wife did not struggle with fertility either. And, for me personally, I think when I had my miscarriage, like I didn't want to talk to anyone that hadn't been through it. So I'm curious how you've navigated that. Not only as a man, but as someone that hasn't struggled with fertility. How have you garnered trust? How have you what's the experience been for you?
It was difficult at first. A healthy dose of like imposter syndrome, right? There was a lot of nights I asked myself like the question, I have these words kind of etched in my head, like, is it okay? Is it okay that I'm doing this? Is it okay that I'm a co-founder and CEO of a women's health company for an experience that, to your point, is so vulnerable, so intimate, generally carried by the woman, right? Males are involved, but the burden of it generally physically is mentally, emotionally is carried by the woman. I'm a male. And to your point, me nor my wife even went through this. So I kept asking myself the question, like, is it okay? Should someone else be building this company? Should it be a woman? Should it be a woman that's been through this experience? And, I tried to, continually answer that question for myself by saying, of course it's okay. Like, you're doing something to bring good into the world. This is a problem that, millions of other people for the last, 50 years IVF's been around could have solved. No one has. You can't second guess yourself for stepping up to fix a problem that you yourself haven't been a part of. I don't know how much that moved the needle for me, like mentally and emotionally. I was still feeling a little uneasy about it. I think when that shift started to take place was when I started to ask that question of women in our community. And I started to ask them.
Ooh, what did they say?
Like, is it okay? It was overwhelmingly like met with like, it's more than okay. There's this quote because we were writing an article recently kind of about this topic. And there's this quote that we found in going through some old emails. And one of the patients that's in our community, wrote to me, she said, the 5 in 6, the 1 in 6, referring to 1 out of every 6. And I think the updated stat is actually now 1 in 5. But at the time it was 1 out of every 6, right? Women are impacted by fertility struggles. And she wrote to me, she said, the 1 in 6 need the 5 in 6 who are not impacted by it to be advocating, to be helping to solve this problem. If not, how else are we ever going to make progress? And it was an interesting, thought, besides the fact it was heartwarming to hear. It brought me back to really where this all started, which is so much of the struggle is happening behind closed doors. And it's not necessarily something women want to talk about. And as long as the problem stays behind closed doors, it's going to be a problem that stays behind closed doors. And so we saw a lot of that on the other side, right? As we're talking to clinics, as we're talking to investors, like there's just this huge education and knowledge gap where so many people didn't even understand what was actually happening. So it's been an interesting journey. And, again, I've tried to lean into the vulnerability and not punish myself for at times feeling insecure and, lean into it, put it out into the world, let the women in your community know that you're struggling with your own set of problems and not to compare problems, but I'm struggling with, the vulnerability of it all. And, again, I think when you put that out into the world, I think people instantly connect over vulnerability, even if they're different experiences. And that was, a really kind of informative moment. And I think also helped me to build the trust with a lot of women in the community when you share a little bit more of that emotional side of it. So it's been a great journey. And by the way, I'm like incredibly grateful to women like you. And, you know, we have a community of about 200, you know, patients. And over the last few years, I've probably connected with almost all of them in some shape or form.
I mean, yeah, I feel so grateful to be able to like meet, you know, when you're talking about the vulnerability and sharing and people kind of suffering behind closed doors, like I'm so grateful for the women that will come on here and share their story. And I did an episode where I shared mine, and it was really scary, but I got amazing feedback. So the community you're also cultivating is amazing. And I'm part of that WhatsApp group, and everyone jumps right in to help or answer questions. And just to have that space is tremendous. Yeah,
it is. I think, you know, again, connection is everything in a world today where I think human connection is harder. I mean, I was on the way here, I was walking over here, and, you know, I was walking to the subway. I'm just looking around, every single person, like every person is, I'm crossing the street, by the way, heads down in phones. And it's just, I mean, human connectivity, it's like, it's never been, you know, more threatened than ever before. And so I think finding ways to foster and facilitate that connectivity, particularly when there's a vulnerable underlying circumstance like fertility struggles, is just, it means the world.
Have you talked to other men going through fertility? Because I think it's really interesting what you said, even, you know, your own experience not being a fertility struggle, but what it's like for a man to watch a birth, what it's like for a man to bring a child home. Have you talked to more men about what their experience is? Because it can feel a lot centered around the woman because it's our bodies. And but through your experience building Dandi, have you had conversations with men about their experience?
I have, a lot less. I've probably, you know, if I had to put numbers to it, I've probably connected with like 250 female patients over the last few years, probably less than 10 males.
Wow.
Now I'll tell you the 10 or so males that I've connected with, very consistent stories. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is like, is there safety? Is there space? Or you know, is society giving men, you know, enough permission to share their stories and to connect with their own emotions and to work through them? And the very common thread across like those 10 or so men was no. And by the way, 1/3 of infertility is tied to male factor infertility, right?
Yeah.
So there's men that behind closed doors are dealing with their own like really heavy, you know, feelings of guilt, of shame, of their own traumas. I mean, I can't, and I don't think it should be emasculating, but I can't think of like many more things that would be right than like a failure to be able to do your part to help your wife and you. I mean, that's got to be incredibly challenging to deal with. And a lot of the men expressed, you know, whether it was male factor infertility or whether they were just watching their wife struggle, there's a lot of heaviness in it for the male. And, you know, I think it's all over the spectrum. Even, you know, I've spoken to men that had a pretty level head on, but even just watching their wife struggle, right?
Yeah.
Talked about how much their relationships have changed, their sexual relationships have changed, you know, the constant needing to be an emotional resource to your wife and not necessarily having the right sounding boards and the right outlets for the male. So I think just going back to your point earlier, I mean, I think overall, like men need more outlets. And as we think about building Dandi, we continue to consider ways we can, you know, expand to be a support system, not just for females.
I was going to ask you that if you see that being some.
I think so. Yeah. We needed to make a calculated decision early on. I mean, there was a lot we wanted to do, and we had to, you know, pick our spots that we wanted to show up in the world with early on. So, you know, figuring out the right ways to support males wasn't kind of a day one thing, but for us, I think it's absolutely on the roadmap. Because even just basic things, going back to community, I mean, you create a community group right now where males that are struggling can talk to each other, and it creates a safe space. And, you know, I was, you know, recently asked to join like a men's group, which is nothing other than a safe space for men to connect, not fertility related, just. And, you know, again, when you kind of open that up and you give males this opportunity to emote and to be with their, it's like the safety valve comes off, and it's like,
they got lots to share.
Yeah, lots to share.
There's a lot of internalizing happening. I don't think I know this, and I'm thinking this as you're talking. How did you choose the name Dandi?
We spent a lot of time on it. I'll try and give you the short version, but Dandi is short for the dandelion flower, which goes through this incredible journey of growth and transformation. We were really obsessed with not just like building great products and services, but we wanted to build a brand that for the first time, people struggling through this could really feel seen and heard in. And so in doing so, we wanted to get to kind of the deepest layers of like, what are women really struggling with, right? And there's a lot of layers to the struggle. I'd say injections and the physical pain is a very real, but that's more of a surface layer struggle. I think we wanted to peel back the layers of the onion. So we brought on like an insights team, and there was 11 amazing women that went really, really deep with us to understand the deepest levels. And it turned into like a 60-page insights report where we went really, really deep. We spent months like with these women going really deep, and we wanted to extract like what was the most consistent underlying theme. And what we found was that underlying it all, what it seemed to be was one of the hardest parts of fertility struggles was the uncertainty of outcome and this
yes.
I don't want to say obsession because that makes it sound like it's the wrong thing, but there was this very heavy emphasis or focus on when am I going to get to the point of having this outcome, right? That I'm looking for.
Speaking directly to me right now.
Which couldn't be more valid,
yeah.
right? But in all these stories we were hearing from patients that were sharing, like I was sitting back and I was, hearing these amazing moments of resilience, of strength, of evolution. And I didn't think that the people sharing those moments with us saw that in themselves. Like women were sharing the most transformational stories. And I'm like, oh my God, you're a superhero. But it didn't seem like they realized that about themselves. And so from a brand standpoint, what we felt like we had the opportunity to do was like, how could we start to shift the narrative a little bit? Doesn't mean you shouldn't still be very focused on the endpoint of getting pregnant, but how could we maybe help you to see that on the journey to get there, you are growing and you are becoming stronger. And sometimes it is those dark, tough moments where you are transforming, even sometimes when that growth is happening beneath the surface. Yeah. And so we became very, very interested with like, what can be a good analog to that? And we started looking at nature. Yeah. And we started looking at this idea that everything in nature kind of grows at its own speed. The tree, the leaf, the flower, it's not concerned with the rate at which it's growing. It just grows.
Oh my God.
And we fell in love with like the dandelion flower because it goes on this amazing journey. I thought the dandelion was just like that yellow.
Right, that's what I thought too.
And then I knew that, that like puff, that white puffball that you blow. And I didn't know that was also the dandelion.
I didn't know that either.
So when we looked into it, it starts as like the yellow flower, then it actually contracts and it completely contracts. And then it shows back up as a more mature life form, which is that puffball. And then by the way, each of those little seedlings on the puffball, they're seeds that the wind will carry. They get carried up to 25 miles. I know I'm like geeking out around this.
I'm like, my jaw's dropping. I'm like, I didn't know any of this.
Those are each little seedlings that will get carried up to 25 miles by the wind with no certainty of when they'll reconnect with Earth. But when they do, wherever they do, they'll plant new life. And the dandelion, I like fell in love with it. I emailed our brand team. I'm like, guys, this is it. Like, This is the most this is the perfect analog. And when you think about the fertility journey, it's uncertain and it's so hard to surrender to that uncertainty. And as a startup founder, I feel a lot of that in a different way.
Well, as you're saying uncertainty, I'm thinking about how that applies to just life in general. Life in general. And that's a lot of what I struggled with through my journey in my 30s, being uncertain if I would meet someone, being uncertain if I would be a mom. And we talk a lot about that, the struggle to get comfortable with uncertainty. But there's so much that we cannot be certain about, and the value of surrendering to the uncertainty. And I resonated really hard with what you were saying about what you learned as you're trying to come up with the name of, wanting that outcome so bad and wanting to know when that outcome is going to happen. And, I relate to what you're saying. I think it's hard to see in the present moment when we're so future focused, like what's the next appointment? What's the next phase? And we can't sometimes see that until we have the outcome. And whether, again, that's fertility or life.
Right.
And I think the process and the work is to be in the journey and to be in the process and less outcome focused.
That's it. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. And like you said, I think that's true of like anything in life. I mean, if you really peel back like the layers of the onion, you look at like most life struggles, like I think a huge part of the time, like the underlying issue, it's uncertainty, right? It's uncertainty of like pregnancy, but it could also be the uncertainty of like the outcome of your job or the job you want to get or the relationship you think you want or finances. I mean, uncertainty, and again, it goes back to like, what have we been conditioned to believe from a really young age? But I think this idea of certainty, which I think certainty versus uncertainty actually really at an even deeper layer goes to control, right? Which I'm sure as a therapist,
the control. We want all the control.
It's all about control. And I'm like, that's in my own journey. That's something I've had to work through a lot, because as a result of, my own kind of experiences as a child growing up, where I think for a long time I showed up as just this free-flowing life form that wasn't necessarily always met with love. I think the identity that developed for me to protect myself from that was control. It was like, well, if the version of me that shows up freely and isn't thinking about a thing isn't met with love, maybe the way that I can protect myself is by starting to control people and things and circumstances. And in the end of the day, that's never like actually going to serve you. It may give you a false sense of safety. So I think, like, to your point, whether it's building a startup, whether it's fertility journeys, and I'll never compare, like, I'm not comparing,
right,
they're all different. So I don't want any listeners to ever think, we're comparing experiences. But at the end of the day, uncertainty is uncertainty. And I do think it is the hardest thing in life, at least one of them, to deal with. And to your point, I think like peace and stillness and happiness, I think comes from embracing that uncertainty. And it requires a deep level of trust and certainty that, like, if we could let go of that need to control and that need to know what the outcome is going to be and when we're going to get that outcome, it requires a leap of faith to trust that, like, everything will work out. And that's been a big part of my journey. Yeah.
I have found that when I can relax into the uncertainty and when I can get really grateful in the present moment, the outcome I am looking for comes to me.
Yeah. And it's not easy. And you mentioned like gratitude, I think is one of the best ways. And I was reading something the other day and it talked about like, basically this, like dealing with uncertainty, dealing with the hard moments. There's this practice of, every time you're feeling a moment of like uncertainty, stress, anxiety, channel gratitude, right? Think about one thing, and what you can actually start to do is because a lot of this is hardwired, a lot of this is like neurological. It's things that have been hardwired into our nervous system. And it talked about like, can you start to rewire? Not can you? You can start to rewire. And a great practice is taking all those moments of uncertainty and starting to really replace them with moments of gratitude, and starting to fire like new neurological connections that something great happened today in my life, right? There's something I could focus on so deeply and channel that energy and that emotion of it. And you start to, change the way we think.
It really works. And I love that you said that you can rewire. And as a therapist, you absolutely can rewire to it. But it's like those intentional practices, like we said, slowing down. Before we wrap up, tell us more about kind of where Dandi is now. You guys just launched. Tell us all the amazing things that you're offering.
Yeah, we launched 3.5 weeks ago. So it's surreal after a few years of building. But we're on the market. We at our core, we offer two things. We offer a line of physical products. It's called the Dandi IVF Care Kit. We spent about 2.5 years developing those with hundreds of patients. As we mentioned, we worked with a couple leading fertility doctors here in New York. So very much took into a lot of consideration the clinical medical side of what women are going through as they go through IVF. And this is the first line of products that exists today to make IVF injections more comfortable, more intuitive, hopefully less distressing. So those are out in the market, and we're already getting amazing patient feedback, which it makes it all worth it to hear that we're positively impacting some IVF experiences. And then around the physical products, we've built a virtual care platform, as we've mentioned. And the whole idea of virtual care is we want to show up in the moments where patients haven't been able to get support elsewhere, whether it be clinics that aren't really built after hours, replacing Google, Reddit forms, all the things that have kind of been the standard of care. So we've built a team of registered fertility nurses. They all have clinical experience. We've gotten them licensed to provide care in all 50 states.
Amazing.
They're available kind of across time zones, all hours, and they're here to support you really every step of the journey, from those really early stage decisions, when you leave your OB and realize you may need to find a fertility clinic and, figure out what comes next. And we know a lot of patients haven't had the right support early on, all the way through navigating the clinic and IVF, frankly, even into postpartum or pregnancy and then postpartum. It's a very different experience. So, we exist kind of at the intersection of products and digital care. And we have a lot of exciting things we'll be launching in the coming months and hopefully years. But it's
and
been
the
a great
intention
journey.
too is to add some therapists to the platform.
Yes.
as well.
So our virtual care today is very, very clinical focused. Again, we needed to kind of say this is what we're going to launch with day one versus day two. But yeah, day one, we're fully focused on kind of the clinical side of it. So injections, helping patients navigate lab results, all the medical things that we know are very difficult. And in the pretty near future, we're going to be scaling that platform to be more integrative. You know, you're in our WhatsApp community group, but one of the biggest things patients are messaging about is, does anyone have a good therapist? Does anyone have a good acupuncturist? Does anyone have a good mindfulness coach?
The resources that are like vetted and trusted.
And they're so fragmented today.
Yeah.
So we see an opportunity on our care platform where we start with nurses and the clinical medical side to branch into something that's more holistic to support in all these areas of care, therapy being one of them. So,
I know. I was like, can I be the therapist? I was like, I don't have that much time.
No, but we'll certainly figure out a way.
Well, I'm always here to support you guys any way that I can, anything that I can do. You know, I am so passionate about this space. I am so internally grateful for you. And to answer your question, is this okay? It is more than okay.
Thank you.
I have chills because you're just doing an amazing, incredible thing for people, and you are filling a gap that should have been filled a really long time ago. So thank you so much for what you're doing. And thank you for being here and sharing. And please, like, any way we can help you or anything, we're here to support this journey.
I think a lot of synergies and a lot of the messages exist at many layers, whether it's fertility or life or a lot of the things you talk about here. So thank you for the great work. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Thank you. This was a pleasure. I love this conversation.
Thank you. Likewise.
If you're someone struggling or relating to the topics that we're talking about now, and you're feeling the anxiety or the stress or the pressure of feeling like you're running out of time, you're behind, and you want some extra support, check out my group therapy practice in Midtown Manhattan, NYC Therapeutic Wellness. We have an amazing team of clinicians ready to support you in your journey, to help you feel more grounded, to help you feel more grateful, to help you feel like you're just exactly where you need to be. So check us out at www.nyctherapeuticwellness.com.